Welcome to the Power of Purity podcast, the show that empowers men to experience their sexual gift in a healthier way. Now here's your host, Tony Ingrassia.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Power of Purity podcast. I'm so thankful that you are with me today, and I do pray that as I begin this new series today, that it will be a blessing to you. This podcast, as you know, is intended to encourage us and strengthen us in our walk of purity. And because of that, I think that we are very unusual men on planet Earth because we live in a very highly sexualized culture. There's a lot of temptation. There's a lot of perversion all around us. And to be seeking to walk in purity, a lot of people would look at us and say, man, you're old-fashioned. You're outdated. What are you thinking? But of course, we're not governed by the understandings and wisdom of this world's culture and what this world's system says about sex and about purity. And we are, in fact, representatives from another kingdom, and therefore we are very concerned about who God is and what God says about sex and what God says about purity. And we're therefore seeking to bring ourselves, our lives, including our sexuality, including our penis, including our orgasm, including the expression of our sexual gift under the authority of God and under the authority of Christ. And we're seeking to honor God with the expression of our sexual gift and to honor our wife with the expression of our sexual gift if we're married, and to honor our future wife with the expression of our sexual gift if we're not married. So that's a little bit about what this podcast is all about. I appreciate you being with me. And I am beginning a new series today that I've entitled 10 Things Every Man Should Know About His Wife When It Comes to Sex. But before I actually start that new series, I thought I'd share a note with you that I received really several months ago. I was going through my file, kind of straightening some things up and reading several of these notes, and I found this particular one, and I thought I'd read it because it was a blessing. And you'll have to forgive me because there's a chance I may have shared this at some point in an earlier episode, but I'm not sure, and I was so blessed by it. When I read it, I thought, I need to share this with the guys on the podcast. So here it is. It says, Tony, no amount that I could give would be able to match the benefit your podcast has given me and my wife. For years, I have struggled with pornography. My wife did not know the extent of my problem. And your ministry has shown me a light at the end of the tunnel. Like many men, my story parallels parts of yours. I prayed for about a year for God to help me with my problem. Then in February, I found your podcast while looking for another pastor. What a blessing. God does work in our lives. I listened every day to catch up, and now I wait for each Tuesday to listen to the new podcast. Importantly, your podcast has helped me understand how events shaped my life, and most importantly, it drove home how much I was hurting my wife and our marriage without her even knowing what was going on. We've been able to talk about my struggle, and she has been very grateful for your work as well. I have not looked at porn for about 4 months now. This podcast and ministry has been a blessing to me and my family, and I hope you're able to use my donation to increase your reach, as so many men need to hear this. God bless you and keep up the good work. So I just really appreciated this letter. It was very encouraging, and it's good to hear from you guys. And good to get a little feedback and to know that the podcast is helping somebody. So I really appreciate that. And of course, this brother references a donation that he gave to the Power of Purity ministry, which I really, really appreciate, because the fact is, this ministry is like any other ministry, and an unfortunate reality is that it takes funds in order to operate a ministry and even expand the ministry. And for those of you that may or may not know, The Power of Purity is a 501c3, and all gifts are tax deductible, and you will get a receipt in exchange for any gift. So I would appreciate your consideration if you would think about it, pray about it, and consider offering a gift to the Power of Purity. It will be used to contribute to the expansion of this ministry and the furtherance of this message of purity around planet Earth. So thank you very much for your consideration, and thank you for this very kind note. And with that being said, I guess I'll go ahead and jump into our new series, which I'm starting today, which I've entitled 10 Things Every Man Should Know About His Wife When It Comes to Sex. And before we get into the 10 things that every man should know, I'd like to share 7 observations or comments in the way of introduction. And the first observation I'd like to share with you is this. Number 1, I want you to know that I personally created this list based upon what I'm quite sure is my very preliminary understanding of women. And the fact is, guys, I do not claim to be an expert on women in general in any form or fashion. And further, I don't claim to be an expert on female sexuality specifically in any form or fashion. So in view of that, I'd like to explain how this particular series came about that I've entitled 10 Things Every Man Should Know About His Wife When It Comes to Sex. And the fact is, I've actually been working for some time on another series of episodes that I entitled 12 Things Every Woman Should Know About Her Husband When It Comes to Sex. And I do intend to record and present that particular series of episodes in the near future. But as I was working on that particular series of episodes, it occurred to me that if I was going to do a series on what women should know about their husbands when it comes to sex, that maybe I should do a series on what men should know about their wives when it comes to sex. So that's how I decided to do this particular series, which I'm beginning today with this particular podcast episode. So I'd like you to know that this list of 10 things that I'm about to share with you concerning the 10 things every man should know about his wife when it comes to sex is actually the result of at least 3 different resources that I drew upon as I was creating this list and developing this podcast. And those 3 resources are these. Number 1, I used my own common sense, and I drew upon everything that I've personally come to know and understand about women during the 60 years that I've been alive on planet Earth. Number 2, I did a significant amount of research on the topic of what women wish their husbands knew when it comes to sex, including a combination of books and articles that were written by experts on the topics of men, women, sex, and marriage. And number 3, I developed these 10 principles in the shadow of my own wife's heart, advice, and guidance. And I discussed these various things with her as I sought her insights and wisdom concerning the things that I'm going to be sharing. And of course, my wife happens to have a distinct advantage over me on this particular topic that I don't have, which is that she happens to be a woman. So she would quite naturally have a more accurate and educated viewpoint on this particular topic than I could ever have. So I want you to know that as a man, I sincerely did my very best in the attempt to accurately represent women when I formulated this list of the 10 things that women wish their husbands understood when it comes to the topic of sex. But with that being said, I'd still like to extend an invitation to my listeners, and especially to my female listeners. And I'd like to request your feedback as you listen to this series of episodes. And I'd like you to please let me know what you think I got right and what I got wrong concerning this particular topic. And if you know a principle or concept that should have been included in this list of 10 things, but I wasn't smart enough to think of it or to include it in the list, then I'd really appreciate your willingness to share that with me. And if I get enough feedback from you ladies, I'd really like to do an additional follow-up episode at some point where I can share the various feedback that I receive from the listening audience. And in that way, we can all continue to learn and grow together. So maybe here's a way to say what I'm trying to say. What if you ladies paused this episode right now and think about this for a few minutes, and then make your own list of 10 things that you think every man needs to understand about his wife when it comes to sex? Just go ahead and make your own list of 10 ideas that you think are important. And then go ahead and hit the play button again and listen to my presentation through these episodes. And then wouldn't it be interesting to compare the list that you came up with to the list that I came up with and to see what differences might exist between those two lists? And then I guess what I'd ask of you, or better said, what I'd invite you to do is to please consider notifying me and informing me of any differences between your list and my list, so I can learn from your point of view and your experience, and we can then together make this list as absolutely accurate as it can possibly be. And with that being said, it brings me to my second introductory observation, which is this. There are only 10 items on this list. And that's why this series of episodes is quite accurately entitled 10 Things Every Man Should Know About His Wife When It Comes to Sex. But there's a reason that I'm mentioning this, because as I've previously noted, I've been working on a companion series which I've entitled 12 Things Every Woman Should Know About Her Husband When It Comes to Sex. So my intention through these two different series was to attempt to speak to both sides of the coin and try to help men in what they need to understand about their wives when it comes to sex, and to try to help women in what they need to understand about their husbands when it comes to sex. So I originally thought to myself that, of course, I should be completely fair in these two presentations, which means that if I have 12 things that every woman should know about her husband when it comes to sex, then I should also have 12 things every man should know about his wife when it comes to sex. And that was my sincere intention the entire time that I was working on these two series of episodes. But then I ran into a problem, and my problem was this. I was only able to come up with 10 things that every man should know about his wife when it comes to sex, even though I had already come up with 12 things that every woman should know about her husband when it comes to sex. And to be honest, that really bothered me for some time, and therefore I labored, and I worked really hard, and I tried really hard to come up with the 2 extra things that I could include on this list that men should know about their wives when it comes to sex. And the fact is, when it was all said and done, I actually came up with a list of 17 different things that husbands should know about their wives when it comes to sex. And I actually spent a considerable amount of time, energy, and effort in my attempt to develop those additional 7 principles. But in the end, I was simply uncomfortable including any of those additional 7 principles because I honestly didn't feel like they had enough significance or relevance to actually make the cut and be included in the final list. And the entire time, I had this nagging feeling that what I was really doing was trying to force 2 more items onto my list that shouldn't really be on the list, because I had to come up with 2 more items so the 2 lists would be the same, 12 things for men and 12 things for women. But in the end, I just couldn't bring myself to include those 2 extra points on the list of what men need to know about their wives when it comes to sex, because in my heart, I felt like they shouldn't really be on the list. So I eventually had to reconcile myself to the conclusion that I would have 10 things men need to know about their wives when it comes to sex, even though I have 12 things that women need to know about their husbands when it comes to sex. So, ladies, if that's unfair, all I can do is apologize for the discrepancy. But please know that I've attempted to represent these two different lists as sincerely and accurately and honestly as I possibly can. And by only providing 10 principles on the list of things that men should know about their wives when it comes to sex, it's not my heart or my intention to be unfair or to discriminate against women in any way. And in view of that, let me share just one final thought before I conclude this particular point, and that is this. As I've already mentioned, I'd love to receive some insight and feedback from the listening audience. So I would ask, can you, dear listener, help me to identify the 2 additional principles that should be included on the list of things that men should know about their wives when it comes to sex? So then the 2 lists will be perfectly fair, and both lists will have 12 principles. And with that being said, it brings me to my third introductory observation for this series, which is this. In this series of episodes, I'm talking about one side of the coin. And as already noted, using the coin metaphor, we learn a very important principle, which is that every coin has 2 sides, right? A heads and a tails. So be it understood that in this particular series of podcast episodes, I'm focusing on just one particular side of the coin and talking about one particular aspect of the sexual relationship between a husband and a wife. And that aspect concerns the 10 things that every man should know about his wife when it comes to sex. But again, as already mentioned, you should know that I intend to follow this particular series of the podcast with another companion series, which will be entitled 12 Things That Every Woman Should Know About Her Husband When It Comes to Sex. And of course, that will be the other side of the coin. So what I'd advocate here is that in order for us to be healthier together as married couples, there are things that men need to understand about their wives, and then there's things that women need to understand about their husbands when it comes to sex. And guys, I'm just thinking that we'd have a better chance to have happier and healthier marriages if we could kind of work on this thing from both ends of the spectrum. And we could get men to better understand what their wives need when it comes to sex, and we could get women to better understand what their husbands need when it comes to sex. So the fact is, the coin has 2 sides, and the street goes both ways. And in this particular series of episodes, we're talking about one side of the coin, and therefore, in the upcoming series, we're going to be talking about the other side of the coin. And that brings me to my 4th introductory observation for this series, which is this. There's an exception to every rule. And what I mean is this. I sincerely believe that the 10 principles I'm going to share honestly apply to most women. But with that being said, I freely acknowledge that there are exceptions to every rule. So maybe every single one of these 10 principles that I'm about to share doesn't apply to every single woman in every single situation or every single marriage in every single situation. But I do believe that in general, these 10 principles are true, and they do apply to most women and most marriages when it comes to sex. And in the way of example, I could say that as a general rule, men like to hunt more than women like to hunt. And I could say that women like to quilt more than men like to quilt. But in some situations, there might actually be a woman who likes to hunt more than her husband does. Or there might be a man who likes to quilt more than his wife likes to quilt. But nevertheless, even given these exceptions, I think that we can still say, as a general rule, that men like to hunt more than women like to hunt, and women like to quilt more than men like to quilt. So these 10 principles might not apply perfectly in every situation, but I do sincerely think they do apply to most women in most situations. And with that being said, it brings me to my 5th observation for these 10 principles, which is this. Observation number 5, and it's the metaphor of how you eat a steak. And how do you eat a steak? You eat the meat and you throw away the bones. So I encourage you guys to listen to these 10 principles and to relate to these ideas and this information in the same way you'd relate to a good steak dinner. Or said another way, eat the meat and throw away the bones. And with that being said, I do trust that you'll always find more meat in my presentation than bones in the things that I'm sharing. But I do not presume that you'll necessarily agree with everything I say or the way I say it. So just take the best and leave the rest. And as they say, please don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. And in view of that, guys, let me share with you a story that I recently became aware of to illustrate the point that I'm trying to make here. And this is the story of a person who wrote to me and told me how much they love the Power of Purity podcast and how much it was helping them in their life and their marriage and how it was helping them see and understand so many things about themselves and about their sexuality and how it was helping them to become healthier in the expression of their sexual gift. And basically, this person went on and on telling me how much they loved the podcast and how much they appreciated it and how much it was helping them. And of course, I was really blessed and I deeply appreciated their feedback and their encouragement. And then sometime later, this same person wrote back to me and they told me how one day they were listening to the podcast, but they turned it off and they stopped listening to me because I said something that they disagreed with. Really. And that's the basis of your ability to listen to this podcast. As long as I say everything in just the way that you can agree with it, then you can listen. But as soon as I say something that you disagree with, then you have to turn off the podcast and stop listening. So, guys, in sharing this story, I'm just appealing to you guys. I do not assume that you'll necessarily always agree with everything I say or the way that I say it, but I trust that you will give me the benefit of the doubt, and I trust you won't throw the baby out with the bathwater, and I trust you won't have to stop listening just because I happen to say something that you're not sure about or that you might not be able to agree with. And I trust that you will be able to relate to this podcast in the same way that you'd relate to a good steak dinner and take the meat and throw away the bones. So please, guys, just know that I'm sincerely doing my very best to discharge the duty that I believe God has called me to in bringing this message of sexual purity to the world. And I'm trying as accurately as I can to represent my understandings of who God is and what God says about men and women and sex and marriage and sexual purity. And I might not always say everything perfectly, and I might not always say it exactly the way I should have said it, but I am doing my very best, and I'll therefore covet your ongoing prayers, and I'll trust your goodness, your good heart, as you continue to give me the benefit of the doubt, and as we continue to move forward on this journey of purity together. And with that being said, it brings me to my sixth introductory observation, which is this: you should still listen to this series of episodes even if you're not married. So please, I would appeal to those who might be single, do not say this to yourself. Well, the title of this series is 10 Things Every Man Should Know About His Wife When It Comes to Sex. So obviously this is for married people, but I'm not married, and therefore this doesn't apply to me, and therefore I'm not going to listen to these episodes. Because the fact is, one day you might get married, and if you understand the principles that we're going to review in these 2 series of episodes, I'd humbly advocate that you'll be strategically positioned and have a far greater chance of having a happy, healthy, successful, and fulfilling relationship and marriage. And in fact, I dare to suggest that if you understand the principles that I'm going to be talking about in these episodes, that it will in fact give you an unfair advantage over many folks who get married. Because if you understand these principles and the dynamics and realities and nuances associated with them, I believe you'll be way ahead on a metaphorical learning curve than most folks who get married but don't understand the dynamics and nuances and realities of these principles. And further, even if you never do get married, I believe the information contained in these 2 series of episodes will help you understand and comprehend some things that are true about men, and some things that are true about women, and some things that are true about sex and true about relationship that will help you be more successful in your personal relationships and your life in general. And that brings me to my 7th and final introductory observation concerning this series, which is this: Observation 7. These 10 principles are not necessarily presented in an order of priority. So in other words, number 1 isn't more important than number 2, 3, or 4 because it precedes numbers 2, 3, and 4. And principle 5 isn't more important than principle 6 because it comes before principle 6, and so forth and so on. So these are 10 principles that every man should know about his wife when it comes to sex, but they're not necessarily presented in any particular order of priority, and therefore I'd suggest that any particular principle is just as important as any other particular principle, regardless of where each principle happens to occur on the list of the 10 principles. And with that being said, it concludes my introductory observations. So may we please have a drum roll as we begin the 10 things every man should know about his wife when it comes to sex. And with that being said, you guys, I see from the clock, unfortunately, that I'm already out of time for this particular podcast episode. And therefore, if you're interested in hearing the 10 things that every man should know about his wife when it comes to sex, then you're invited to come back next week and meet me here at the Power of Purity podcast. As you know, a new episode is published every Tuesday, and by God's grace, I haven't missed a single week yet since I started the podcast. So come back next Tuesday, and we are going to jump in to principle number 1 of the 10 things every man should know about his wife when it comes to sex. So thanks for being with me for this episode, which has turned out to be an introduction to these 10 principles that I'll begin to share next week. I look forward to seeing you guys back here next week at the Power of Purity podcast. God bless you guys, and in the meantime, have an awesome week, have an awesome day, and be blessed by God as you continue your walk of sexual purity. God bless you. See you then.
Thanks for listening. Visit powerofpurity.org for more resources and information. And if this podcast has been helpful or encouraging, please invite a friend to listen. Until next time, remember, there's power in purity.